Beneath the vast sun-drenched skies of Africa lies a world where the rhythm of survival beats loud and fierce, a land where every creature plays its part in a delicate balance of life and death. Here the predators reign supreme, their lives shaped by skill, strategy, and instinct. From the thunderous roars of lions to the swift, silent strikes of leopards, Africa's predators are the guardians of its ecosystems, maintaining harmony in the wild. Welcome to Africa, a realm of raw beauty and untamed power. Welcome to NhaUyen TV channel. Join us as we delve into its heart, where every creature, from the smallest insect to the most fearsome beast, contributes to the magnificent tapestry of life. Embark on this journey into Africa's wild heart, where the stories of its creatures inspire awe and reverence, a testament to the power and fragility of life itself. The royal lions, kings of the savannah. In the heart of the African savannah, where golden grasses stretch endlessly under a vast sky, the lion reigns supreme. These majestic creatures, often revered as the rulers of the wild, embody strength, strategy, and social intelligence. Lions are unique among big cats for their highly structured social lives, living in groups known as prides. A pride typically consists of several closely related lionesses, their cubs, and one or a few dominant males who oversee the group's well-being. The lionesses, silent strategists and skilled hunters. At the core of the pride survival are the lionesses, exceptional hunters known for their cooperative tactics, using the cover of tall grasses and the natural conjures of the land. They work in unison to orchestrate ambushes on prey. Their targets range from swift antelopes and sturdy zebras to larger, more formidable animals like buffaloes and even juvenile elephants. Each hunt is a display of precision and teamwork. Lionesses often divide roles. Some lie in wait, while others drive the prey toward the ambush point. Their silent communication through subtle tail flicks, body movements, and eye contact is key to their success. Once the prey is within striking distance, the lionesses act with breathtaking speed and strength, bringing down animals many times their size. The males, guardians of the pride. While the lionesses are on the front lines of hunting, the males are the pride's protectors. Their primary role is to defend the territory from rival males and other predators. A male lion's imposing size and mane, a thick dark collar of hair, serve as both armor and a visual signal of dominance. These males frequently patrol the boundaries of their domain, roaring to assert their presence and warn intruders to stay away. The roar of a lion is one of nature's most awe-inspiring sounds, echoing across the savannah for up to 5 miles. It serves multiple purposes, announcing the pride's claim over a territory, rallying pride members, and intimidating potential threats. The sight of a male lion on the horizon, silhouetted against the setting sun, is a vision of power and legality, unity and the cycle of life. Life in upright is an intricate dance of interdependence. Cubs born after a gestation period of about 110 days rely entirely on their mothers for the first few weeks of life. Lionesses cooperate in raising the cubs, nursing and protecting not just their own, but those of other females in the pride. However, the savannah is as dangerous as it is beautiful. Cubs face threats from rival males, seeking to take over the pride, as these males often kill the offspring of their predecessors. to establish their dominance. This brutal cycle ensures that only the strongest genes are passed on, maintaining the vigor of future lion generations. A living symphony. Observing upright of lions is akin to witnessing a living symphony where each member plays a vital role, from the coordinated hunts of the lionesses to the commanding roars of the males and the playful antics of cubs. Every moment is a testament to the intricate balance of life. The lions of the savannah are more than just predators. They are symbols of strength, unity, and survival. Their existence is a reminder of the majesty of the wild and the importance of preserving these remarkable creatures for generations to come. The masters of stealth leopards. Amid the dense underbrush of forests, shadowy thickets, and craggy escarpments, leopards reign as the embodiment of stealth and solitude. Their elusive nature, combined with exceptional adaptability and hunting prowess, makes them one of the most enigmatic predators in the animal kingdom. Unlike lions, which thrive in social structures, leopards are solitary by design, masters of their territories and rulers of the unseen. A predator built for secrecy. The leopard's lithe, muscular body is the ultimate tool of a stealth predator. Weighing between 60 to 170 pounds, depending on sex and subspecies. They are not the largest of the big cats, but are undoubtedly among the most agile. Their coats, adorned with rosettes unique to each individual, offer perfect camouflage, blending effortlessly into a variety of landscapes, from the golden savannas to dense green jungles. The art of ambush. Leopards are consummate ambush predators, relying on patience, precision, and surprise to secure their meals. Preferring twilight and darkness for hunting, they use the shadows to their advantage. A leopard will often stalk its prey silently, moving with deliberate grace until it is close enough for a lightning-fast attack. Once within range, it launches with explosive speed, delivering a powerful bite to the neck or throat to subdue its target. Their diet is as diverse as their habitats, encompassing everything from small antelope and warthogs to monkeys, birds, and even fish. This adaptability ensures their survival in areas where other predators might struggle. Masters of the vertical world. One of the leopard's most awe-inspiring abilities is its skill in navigating the vertical plane. These cats are unrivaled climbers, capable of scaling trees with ease, even while carrying prey that weighs more than twice their body mass. This remarkable feat is not just a display of strength, but a vital survival strategy. By hoisting keels into the branches, leopards protect their hard-earned meals from scavengers like hyenas and lions. High in the treetops, the leopard's prey is safe from all but the most determined competitors. Here the predator can eat at leisure or stash its food for later consumption. This behavior underscores the leopard's solitary and resourceful nature traits that have allowed it to thrive in some of the harshest environments on Earth. Silent sentinels of the wild. Leopards are territorial animals, marking their domains with a combination of scent, marking, scratches on trees, and vocalizations, including a distinctive rasping call. These signals serve as warnings to rivals and as beacons for potential mates. While primarily solitary, leopards exhibit a fleeting social side. During mating seasons or when females are raising cubs, female leopards are fiercely protective mothers, often moving their cubs between hidden dens to shield them from predators. The cubs born with fuzzy coats and indistinct spots, remain dependent on their mothers for several months, learning the skills of hunting and survival. Through observation and play, nature's enigma, the leopard's ability to adapt to a wide range of habitats, from arid deserts to lush rainforests, combined with its elusive behavior, has earned it a reputation as one of the most enigmatic creatures of the wild. Sightings are rare and fleeting, often no more than a glimpse of a spotted coat. Melting into the shadows, these solitary predators are more than just hunters. They are symbols of independence and resilience. To encounter a leopard in its natural habitat is to witness the art of stealth and survival perfected, a living testament to the beauty and balance of the wild. The guardians of the water, hippos and crocodiles. At the shimmering expanse of Lake Victoria, serenity cloaks a world of hidden tension, where giants and predators rule the waters in an eternal struggle of dominance and survival. Hippos and Nile crocodiles, two titans of the aquatic realm, embody the fragile balance of life. In Africa's largest freshwater lake, the hippo's aquatic architects. By day, hippos are seen lounging in large pods, their immense bodies half submerged, with only their nostrils, eyes and ears visible above the surface, like natural periscopes. These colossal herbivores, weighing up to 4,000 pounds, appear deceptively docile as they bask in the sunlit waters. Yet beneath this calm facade lies a creature of immense power and influence. Hippos are territorial, guardians of their watery domains, and their sheer size makes them one of the most formidable animals in Africa. Males defend their stretches of the lake with ferocity, engaging in battles where yawning displays of their massive tusks escalate into thunderous clashes. These confrontations, though rare, are dramatic spectacles, underscoring the stakes of survival in this dynamic ecosystem. At night, hippos leave the safety of the water, lumbering onto land in a slow but purposeful march. They graze tirelessly on grasses, consuming up to 88 pounds in a single night. This nocturnal feeding serves an ecological purpose. Their grazing prevents overgrowth, maintaining open spaces for other species and promoting plant regrowth. As they return to the water, their trails leave behind natural irrigation pathways, shaping the wetlands and ensuring the retention of vital moisture. During the dry season, despite their herbivorous diet, hippos are far from harmless. They are fiercely protective of their young and capable of turning their immense strength against any perceived threat, including unwelcome intruders, such as crocodiles or even humans who wander too close. The crocodile's silent assassins. Lurking beneath the placid surface, Nile crocodiles are the water's shadowy rulers, masters of stealth and ambush. Measuring up to 18 feet in length and weighing over a ton, these prehistoric predators are perfectly adapted to their role as apex hunters. Camouflaged by their olive green and gray scales, crocodiles remain nearly invisible in the murky waters. Only their eyes and nostrils break the surface as they patiently await the perfect moment to strike. When an unsuspecting animal ventures close for drink, the crocodile explodes into action. With astonishing speed, it lunges forward, its powerful jaws clamping down. With a force of over 3,000 pounds per square inch, one of the strongest bites in the animal kingdom, the captured prey has little chance of escape. Employing their infamous death roll, crocodiles spin rapidly, tearing flesh and subduing their victim. through sheer power and disorientation. This brutal efficiency makes them fearsome predators, capable of hunting a variety of species, from fish and birds to mammals that stray too close to the water's edge. Yet, the role of Nile crocodiles extends beyond predation. By targeting the weak, sick, or unwary, they help maintain the health of other populations, ensuring that only the strongest individuals survive. They also play a crucial role in nutrient cycling, as their feeding habits redistribute energy throughout the aquatic ecosystem. A tense coexistence. The interaction between hippos and crocodiles is a fascinating study in coexistence. While both species share the waters, they do so warily, each aware of the other's potential for danger. Adult hippos, with their immense bulk and powerful jaws, are formidable, enough to deter crocodiles from direct conflict. However, young or injured hippos are not immune to the crocodile's opportunistic strikes. This uneasy truce underscores the delicate balance of power in Lake Victoria. Hippos as the ecosystem's architects, and crocodiles as its enforcers, play complementary roles in shaping their shared environment. Together they ensure the vitality and sustainability of this watery domain, demonstrating the intricate interplay of survival and interdependence in the natural world. To witness the hippo's dominance and the crocodile's deadly patience is to see the unvarnished truth of nature, a realm of beauty, tension, and balance, where every creature contributes to the larger story of life. The sky's watchers, eagles and vultures. Above the golden expanse of the African savanna, the skies come alive with drama and precision, as aerial predators and scavengers dominate the air. Their wings cut through the heavens, their cries echoing across the land, a constant reminder of their pivotal role in the circle of life. Among them, the martial eagle stands as a fierce sentinel, while the ever-watchful vultures hover like ominous shadows weaving a story of life, death, and renewal. The martial eagle, a fearless predator, with a wingspan reaching nearly to 0.6 meters. 8.5 feet, the martial eagle commands the skies as one of Africa's most formidable raptors. Its powerful flight is a symphony of strength and grace, soaring high above the plains, where it scans the earth with extraordinary vision. Capable of spotting prey from heights exceeding 3 miles, this eagle is a master of precision strikes. The martial eagle hunts with an elegance that belies its ferocity. Its talons, curved like deadly scythes, are strong enough to crush bones, enabling it to subdue prey as large as young antelopes, warthogs, and even monkeys. In a breathtaking display of aerial power, it swoops down at incredible speeds, striking its target with the force of a predator born to rule the skies. Beyond its hunting prowess, the martial eagle is a symbol of wilderness majesty, embodying the untamed beauty of Africa. Yet its solitary nature and vast hunting territories often leave it unseen, a silent ruler of the aerial realm. Vultures, nature's cleanup crew. In stark contrast to the martial eagle's deadly precision, vultures circle the skies in patient anticipation. Their sharp eyes and powerful sense of smell, attuned to the scent of death. While their ungainly appearance and reputation as scavengers often inspire aversion, vultures are indispensable to the savannas. Ecological balance. Descending in spirals from the heavens, vultures gather at carcasses, like nature's cleanup crew, stripping away flesh with ruthless efficiency. Their powerful beaks tear through tough hides, consuming what others leave behind. This act of consumption, though grim, prevents the spread of diseases, such as anthrax and botulism, safeguarding the health of the ecosystem. Among the most iconic is the white-backed vulture, its pale plumage glinting under the sun, as it soars in search of its next meal. When a kill is located, these scavengers descend en masse, squabbling over scraps in a chaotic but vital feast. Within hours, a carcass that might otherwise decay for days is reduced to bare bones, leaving the savanna clean and ready for renewal. The balance of the skies. Though their roles are vastly different, eagles and vultures together maintain a delicate balance. In the African wilderness, the martial eagle, a symbol of strength and vitality, ensures that prey populations remain controlled, while vultures complete the cycle by ensuring no resource is wasted. Their contrasting behaviors, one a hunter of the living, the other a devourer of the dead, are complementary forces, each vital to the savanna's survival. Witnessing these avian masters in action is to observe nature's intricate design, a dynamic interplay of predator and scavenger. Whether it's the powerful strike of a martial eagle or the eerie descent of a vulture flock, these birds remind us of the complexity and beauty of life in the wild, a world where every role, no matter how fearsome or unglamorous, contributes to the greater harmony of the ecosystem. The challenges ahead. Despite its richness, Africa's wildlife faces immense challenges. Climate change disrupts migration patterns and reduces water availability, forcing predators to adapt their hunting strategies. Human activities such as deforestation and poaching further threaten these delicate ecosystems. Yet hope remains. Conservation efforts and sustainable practices offer a chance to protect these wild lands for generations to come. As we marvel at Africa's breathtaking beauty, we are reminded of our responsibility to preserve its wonders. Embark on this journey into Africa's wild heart, where the stories of its creatures inspire awe and reverence, a testament to the power and fragility of life itself. As we leave the wild heart of Africa, the echoes of its untamed beauty linger, a world where every animal, plant and element of nature intertwines in a delicate dance of survival. Yet the challenges these creatures face are reminders of the fragility of this balance. Human activity, climate change, and habitat loss pose threats that could unravel the intricate web of life. However, all is not lost. Across the continent, efforts are underway to safeguard its wonders. From national parks like the Serengeti to marine reserves around Zanzibar, protected areas provide refuge for countless species. Community-driven conservation initiatives engage local populations, showing that humans and wildlife can coexist and thrive together. Young lion cubs learning to hunt, cheetah mothers teaching their young the art of survival, and red colobus monkeys swinging through Zanzibar's forests are all symbols of resilience. These creatures embody the wild's enduring spirit, but they also depend on us to ensure their continued survival. By supporting ecotourism, sustainable practices, and conservation programs, we can help secure a future where these ecosystems flourish. Technologies like satellite tracking of wildlife, sustainable fishing practices, and anti-poaching measures are becoming crucial tools in the fight to protect Africa's natural heritage. Africa's story is one of grandeur and struggle, of ancient rhythms and future possibilities. Each predator's hunt, every migration of wildebeest, and the whispers of wind through the grasslands are chapters in this ongoing tale. It's a narrative that calls for guardianship, understanding, and action. As you reflect on this journey, Consider the power each of us holds to contribute to preserving this magnificent wilderness. By raising awareness, supporting conservation, and respecting the natural world, we can ensure that the legacy of Africa's woodlands continues to inspire and thrive. So let the call of the wild resonate within you, a reminder that the tale of Africa is not just its own, but a shared narrative of life on Earth. Together we can ensure that this story full of beauty, drama, and wonder remains one of hope and renewal. Thank you for watching the entire video with NhaUyen TV. Wishing you endless joy and an abundance of positive energy.